Hello students, this is Professor McDermott. Let's catch up on what was happening in Asia during the Age of Exploration and the early modern period, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. To a large extent, the story of Asia during this era is a story of decline relative to Europe. Now, you have to understand that Christian Europe, in terms of wealth and technology, had been the least impressive of the three great civilizations of the world during the Middle Ages. The Islamic world had been far more wealthy, powerful, and advanced than Europe during the Middle Ages, and the Chinese were the most advanced of all in terms of technology, inventions, standard of living. So, how did it come about that moving into the modern period, Europe became the dominant civilization on the globe, and in fact wound up colonizing large parts of Asia? That's the story we want to tell. How were the seeds of European dominance set during this early modern period? Well, let's look at some of the great Muslim powers. Um, the most important, or at least the Muslim empire that had the most relation to Europe during the Middle Ages, was known as the Ottoman Empire. It was based in what is now Turkey, and it was founded by its first sultan, Sultan Osman, in the late 13th century. Reached its greatest power under Sultan Suleiman, who reigned from 1520 to 1566. And by the way, whenever you see that abbreviation R period during these lectures, it's talking about when a ruler reigned or ruled over a certain kingdom. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire attacked Europe and actually got as far as Vienna, Austria in 1526, and really looked like it might sweep through Europe and subjugate Christian Europe and make it an Islamic region. And the Europeans were able to defeat the Muslims at the gates of Vienna only with the greatest difficulty in 1526, and then again in 1683. When the Ottomans also laid siege to Vienna. So you see here really the great power of the Ottoman Empire relative to Europe. Also, under Suleiman, the Ottomans were able to take over Egypt. Now, Egypt had been Muslim for many years, but it had been ruled for about 300 years by a group called the Mamluks. Now, the Mamluks were soldiers, they were slaves, and I promised in the Atlantic World lecture I would talk about this effect of slavery in the Muslim world. Basically, the Egyptians had brought in large numbers of slaves from Eastern Europe, Slavs, whom they used for soldiers, and forcibly converted them to Islam. But over time, these soldiers, called Mamluks, became so powerful that in the 13th century they actually took over the government of Egypt. And this was kind of a fascinating group. They were an all male closed caste or social group. Homosexuality was very prevalent among the Mamluks, even though it was strictly forbidden by the Muslim Sharia law. And so this group of soldiers, so similar to the homosexual dominance of the military in ancient Greece, managed to keep power over Egypt for hundreds of years until the Ottomans took it from them under Sultan Suleiman. So this Ottoman Empire was really a great world superpower in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. However, they acquired a rival Muslim power in the form of the Safavid Empire. In the year 1501, a man named Ismail was able to unite the region formerly known as Persia, now known as Iran, and parts of Afghanistan into a great Muslim empire that we call the Safavid Empire. And so the Safavids fought frequently with their fellow Muslims, the Ottomans, and so gradually the Safavids and the Ottomans weakened each other through this constant infighting. And by the way, Ismail was the first to bear the title of Shah. This was the Persian name for a king. The last Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was overthrown in 1979 by the Islamic Revolution led by Ayatollah Khomeini, which created the Islamic fundamentalist state of Iran as we know it today. A third great Muslim power was formed on the Indian subcontinent beginning in 1526 under the rule of a man named Babur, and we call this the Mughal Empire. So you see that there were three powerful Muslim empires as of the 16th century. But the Columbian Exchange and the effects of the Europeans' exploitation of the New World had a tremendous effect on the Muslim world. Now, we've seen how in Europe the fact that the Spanish were importing huge amounts of gold and especially silver changed the European economy. We saw the sudden increase in the money supply in Europe, bringing about inflation, much higher prices. We saw the terrible impact that that had on lower class people, many of whom wound up emigrating to the New World because they simply couldn't afford to live in Europe in this inflationary time. Well, something very similar happened in the Muslim world. The Muslims were great traders, and they traded with Europe. And this New World silver found its way into the Ottoman Empire and the rest of the Muslim world. And the business people in the Islamic world adopted silver as their preferred currency and gradually became dependent on silver from the New World, which meant that they wanted to trade more and more with Christian Europe. Now, the Ottoman leaders saw the potential dangers of this. They saw that it could destabilize the Ottoman Empire, and so they took steps to lessen trade with Europe, but that merely drove the trade underground into the black market in the Ottoman Empire, which meant that the Ottoman business people were just as dependent on New World silver as they had been before, but that the Ottoman government didn't reap any benefits from this trade in the form of taxes, and that weakened the Ottomans. Also, in the region of Anatolia in Turkey, the peasants suffering from the inflation caused by the influx of silver revolted during the early 17th century, and this was a very bloody revolt that took many years for the Ottomans to put down. So you see how the effects of the discovery of the New World had a very destabilizing effect even on the Ottoman Empire. In the Mughal Empire, too, in India, the inflation was felt, and so there was widespread rebellion among the poor people. Now, India, of course, had the famous caste system, a very strict hierarchical ordering of who was higher and who was lower in society. One of the lower castes, called the Jat, rebelled in the early 18th century, suffering from hard times from the inflation, as did poor peasants in the Punjab region of northwestern India, eastern Pakistan today. And so there was a great deal of instability in the Ottoman Empire, in the Mughal Empire, and also in the Safavid Empire, which began to implode in the 18th century for similar reasons. So the Muslim world is declining relative to Europe, but what about China? China had really been the world's superpower during the Middle Ages, incredibly prosperous, militarily very powerful, technologically extremely advanced. The great English scientist and statesman Francis Bacon pointed out that three inventions had revolutionized Europe, and those were the printing press, the compass, and gunpowder. And all three inventions had been inspired by Chinese innovations. And so, um, also, China had a tremendous navy, and they could have taken the lead in terms of exploring and colonizing and trading with the entire world. In fact, between the years 1405 and 1433, the Chinese admiral Zheng He led a series of voyages that you see here in the red lines on the map, establishing trading connections with people as far away as Eastern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. So, if it had wanted to, China could really have been the dominant civilization moving into the modern era. Why weren't they? Why didn't they play the role that the Europeans did in terms of exploration, colonization, and settlement? Well, the rulers of China during the late Middle Ages were from the Ming family. They were known as the Ming Dynasty of Chinese emperors. And they saw the destabilizing potential of trade with the rest of Europe. They didn't want to experience the inflation that they knew would come from an influx of precious metals from the rest of the world. But the problem was that China had an enormously long sea coast, and even with their great navy, it was impossible for the Ming rulers of China to police this entire sea coast to prevent smuggling and illegal trade. And so the main solution was simply to try to cut off all trade with the rest of the world. And they felt justified in doing that because, after all, China was number one. Uh, and they believed they had everything that they needed already, so why should they bother to trade with these barbarians from this backward place called Europe? However, the Chinese did continue to trade with their near neighbor Japan, and Japan, as we'll see, was trading with the Europeans, and so quite a bit of New World silver managed to get into China through this trade with Japan, and that led in China as well to inflation and sometimes deflation when the government would try to stop the inflation. And so this cycle of inflation and deflation really hurt the Chinese peasants, damaged the economy, made it difficult for business people to prosper in China, and led to a great deal of unrest and, again, revolt and rebellion within China, just as in the Muslim empires. And the rebellion spread to the point that the Ming Dynasty was seriously weakened, and a group from northeastern China called the Manchus were able to overthrow the Ming and establish the Qing Dynasty, which lasted from 1644 until the overthrow of the last emperor Puyi in the year 1911, as chronicled in the great Academy Award-winning film The Last Emperor. Under the Qing, trade was banned with Europe, and the Qing essentially had no interest in the rest of the world. They tried to get China to close in on itself, to become a self-enclosed, self-contained empire, somewhat like the mercantile empires of Europe. And the attitude of the Qing towards trade with Europe was summed up in 1792, when the British sent an ambassador to the Emperor Qianlong of China, asking to open trade with the Chinese, and the emperor responded curtly, quote, "We possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufactures. End quote. And so, by trying to protect itself, essentially the Chinese cut themselves off from the rest of the world, which in the long run weakened them with respect to Europe, which was forever expanding, growing, and becoming more powerful during the early modern and modern periods. However, a very different and more effective approach was taken in the country of Japan. Now, in Japan in the 16th century, you had an emperor who was believed to be a god, and so you would expect him to have a great deal of power, but in fact, the emperor was a sort of figurehead with very little real political power. The real powers in society were the daimyos, who were local lords, each of whom would have a large army of retainers or servants and soldiers who were known as samurai. And so this was the beginning of the samurai code of ethics in Japan, a rigorous training to become a strong warrior, and the determination especially never to surrender, to commit suicide rather than suffer the shame of surrendering to an enemy. And this samurai code obviously existed and persisted into the 20th century, and that's why during World War II there were many examples of Japanese soldiers who killed themselves rather than surrender to American troops during the Pacific War. And it also helps to explain the kamikaze pilots who committed suicide by flying their planes into American ships and aircraft carriers. So this was a very powerful, long-lasting tradition, this samurai warrior culture of Japan. In 1603, one of the local daimyos, whose name was Tokugawa Ieyasu, started calling himself the shogun. So in other words, he made himself the supreme daimyo, second only to the emperor within Japan. And so he and his successors from the Tokugawa family are known as the Tokugawa shoguns of Japan. This rule by the Tokugawa family lasted from 1603 to 1867. Tokugawa moved the capital to Edo on the largest island of Japan, which is now the city of Tokyo, and set about consolidating his power over all the other islands. And in so doing, the Tokugawa shoguns really used a very clever strategy with regard to the Europeans who were knocking on their door and wanting to trade with them. Essentially, Japan did allow European trade, but they were very careful that it always take place on their own terms. They controlled the trade and used it to their own benefit. For example, when the Portuguese showed up with their advanced European ships, the Tokugawa shoguns allowed the Portuguese to anchor their ships in their harbors, but they insisted that the Portuguese show them how to make and operate these ships. And so pretty soon the Japanese were able to create a powerful fleet of what were called Red Seal ships, modeled after European vessels, and to use these for trade and military purposes. The Japanese also insisted that if the Portuguese were going to trade with them, they had to trade guns and advanced European weapons, using gunpowder, to the Japanese, and to teach them how to use and to maintain these early muskets, these early guns. And so we see already in 1592, when Japan went to war with China over control of the Korean Peninsula, that the Japanese had a big advantage because they were using European weapons. Finally, the European powers, especially Portugal, also sent missionaries to Japan, and they actually succeeded in converting more than 100,000 Japanese to Catholic Christianity. Now, the Japanese shoguns saw the danger in this, speaking strictly from a political perspective, that it would undermine reverence for the emperor as a god and the ancestral Japanese customs. And so eventually, Japan decided to expel the missionaries and actually killed, martyred a great many missionaries and Japanese Christians. This event is commemorated in a movie. As I speak this, it's now 2016, and a movie is shortly to come out called Silence, which talks about the suffering of the Japanese Christians who were driven underground. But it's very interesting that when trade reopened with Japan and between Japan and the Western world in the 19th century, Christians came to Japan and they were shocked to find some Japanese who were still secretly baptizing their children and teaching them Christian prayers like the Hail Marys. So these Japanese Catholics essentially went underground and were able, even without ministers or priests, to keep their faith going for hundreds of years in secret. Very interesting story. But after the expulsion of the Catholic missionaries from Portugal, Japan afterwards preferred to trade with Protestant European powers who were less interested in missionary activity in Japan. And so Japan essentially very, very cleverly harnessed this European trade and turned it to their own purposes, used it to build up their power rather than allow their power to be undermined by these foreign influences. And so, moving into the modern period, it was Japan that was poised to emerge as the great Asian superpower.